Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to December and the December edition of our very special series, FAWC Friday. It was very cool to kick off the night tonight with the partnership with the Provincetown IB schools. You might have noticed there were tons of kids running around, and so it was great to have that community here with us and to welcome Nancy Flasher and Michael Gillane and others. So thank you all for joining us. Please join me in a big round of applause for DJ Gregory Fenton for the fantastic start to the night. And a huge thank you to Craig Sutherland of Parties and his team for feeding us so well tonight. I think there's still some food left over. Happy Holly Folly, everybody. It is a busy weekend in Provincetown. My name is Sharon Poley, and I am the executive director here at the Fine Arts Work Center. Tonight, we come together to celebrate artists and writers. Through their creativity and vision, they make our world a more beautiful, a more just, and a more hopeful place. And it means so much to be together with artists and writers here in Provincetown, a community that is so deeply committed to creative exchange and dialogue. I want to give a really special welcome to the 2023-24 fellows who join us tonight. We're so glad you all are part of our community. The Fine Arts Work Center is an artist-led organization that supports artistic freedom, nurtures creative connections, and makes possible artistic achievements that are important to the larger culture. And our fellowship program is essential to this mission. Thank you to the FAWC staff who worked so hard to bring this program together. Throughout the whole evening, we're going to be activating spaces across the campus with music, art, books, food, conversation. There are schedules throughout the space. We'll kick off the evening tonight with presentations by two acclaimed visiting guests, poet Paul Tran and artist Kerry Downey. Following their presentations, we're really grateful that Paul and Kerry will join us for a moderated audience Q&A, so get all your great questions stored. And Paul will also be available to sign copies of their debut work, All the Flowers Kneeling. Then afterward, from 7:30 to 9, first we're gonna break out the wine, now that the kids have left. Then we're gonna invite everybody to visit Open Studios by a selection of our fellows. And in the Hudson D. Walker Gallery, you can also visit the Open Studio by our Stephen Pace Artist-in-Residence, Maya Chow, and collaborator Henry Bradley. Don't miss it. Vicki Tomeko will be in our print shop with some more hands-on printmaking. So all the spaces that are marked by banners are available for you to enter. Special thanks to our partner East End Books. We hope you visit the pop-up bookshop and get all of your holiday gifts. Finally, I just want to thank everybody here with us tonight. The Provincetown community is so generous to all of the arts organizations here in town. We truly could not do our work without you. And so if you leave tonight feeling inspired, we hope you might consider making a year-end gift to FAWC or one of the other amazing arts and culture organizations in our community. Your support truly makes a huge difference. So it's my pleasure tonight now to introduce Poetry Fellow Tyler Rosso to the stage. Come join us to welcome our first guest.
Hello, I'm Tyler. It's truly such an honor to introduce Paul Tran tonight, whose work constantly deepens my understanding of what a poem is capable of. So maybe this is an experimental introduction. You'll have to just let me know. But anyway, when I'm deliberate, I'm liberated, Paul Tran writes in the first Scheherazade, and Paul Tran's poetics is a poetics of deliberateness. Every line carved precise as a reflection. So this is the experimental part. Okay. I'm going to ask you to repeat after me, and I want you to focus your attention on the architecture of your mouth as you speak. So repeat after me. There's a dark so deep beneath the sea. The creatures beget their own light. Thank you. That's the first that's the first sentence of Paul Tran's Bioluminescence. And when you spoke it, I hope you felt how your tongue cut against your teeth and choked on every T and N, how much breath you must spend shaping those D's and B's which jet what little air you have left out of your mouth, how few of the words touch, the TH's and S's walls between them, each sound a claw, a fleeting moment of survival. So one more time. Repeat after me. This feat, this fact of adaptation, I could say is beautiful. So by halfway through the second line, your tongue is longing for rest from these sharp, confining sounds. And when we arrive at this I could say, you can feel the I and ooh and a dropping the pressure from the teeth to the throat just in time for what we could call beauty. Notice when you say beautiful, how your tongue curls inward on the full to create a cradle against your teeth. This is to say, whenever I read Paul Tran's poetry, I become a student of the smallest intervals of meaning making up to the largest, and I become a student too of their inventiveness and re-inventiveness, their intervention in the erasures by language and violence and empire, their making a way despite. Paul Tran's debut poetry collection, All the Flowers Kneeling, won the Golden Poppy Award and was a finalist for the PEN Open Book Award, Lambda Literary Foundation Award, and Kate Tufts Discovery Award. A former Ruth Lilly Stegner and National Endowments for the Arts Fellow, Paul Tran is currently an assistant professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And again, it is such an honor to welcome Paul Tran to the stage.
Lipstick Elegy. I climbed down to the beach facing the Pacific Ocean, where torrents of rain sure the sand. On the other side, my grandmother sleeps soundlessly in her bed, her aoyai of the whitest silk. Oh, my mother, she knew her mother had died long before the telephone rang like bells, announcing the last American helicopter leaving Saigon. Arrow shot back to its bow, long distance missile. I know she'd fly home if she could. She works overtime instead. Curls her hair with hat rollers, rouges her cheeks like Gong Li in Raise the Red Lantern, and I'm just her understudy, hiding in the doorways between her grief and mine. I apply her foundation to my face, conceal the parts of me that she conceals, puckering my lips as if to kiss a man who'd want to love me the way I wanted to be loved. And yes, I said all their bewitching names aloud. Twisted Rose, Fuchsia in Paris, Irreverence. I picked the lipstick she would least approve. Wrapped a white towel around my waist, danced for hours in the kitchen, checking my reflection in a charred skillet. I laughed her laugh. It was the way my grandmother used to laugh when she was alive, when she taught me how to pray from the Gyudai Bi, when I braided her hair in the unbearable heat, my tiny fingers weaving each silver strand into a fishtail, French twist, each knot another child she never got to name. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mother of my mother, immortal Buddha with 1,000 hands, chewing a fist, a beetroot, your teeth, black as dawn, no child in our family stays a child their mother can love. How are we doing, everybody? It is so good to see you. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me. The poems I'm going to read to you tonight come from my first collection, which began 10 years ago when I was raped my junior year in college and had to go back in time and reckon with the experience of having been molested by my father as a child, of the women in my family persisting through similar sexual trauma as part of the French Indochina War and the American War in Vietnam. But let me tell you, the word rape, The word trauma, the word victim do not appear anywhere in this book because this is a book about survival, and it's a book about love and knowledge, whether the knowledge that we are worthy of things like love is that enough for us to get the lives we want. And so I see these poems as love songs to the women in my family. They are love songs to immigrants and refugees who cross oceans to do the impossible thing. They are love songs to queer and trans people of color who every day do the unimaginable by inventing new lives. And so I also have to admit that sometimes the work of doing the unimaginable is very boring. It is very difficult to be healing all the time, to reparent yourself and your parents. And so I was just talking to some new friends earlier about self-implication. And so in writing these poems, I had to implicate myself and really be honest if there were moments in which I acted against my own self-interest, if I ever wanted not to survive. Galileo. I thought I could stop time by taking apart the clock. Minute hand, hour hand, nothing can keep, nothing is kept, only kept track of. I felt passing seconds accumulate like dead calves in a thunderstorm of the mind, no longer a mind, but a page torn out of the dictionary with the definition of the word self effaced. I could not face it. The world moving on as if nothing happened. Everyone I knew got up, got dressed, went to work. There were parties, ecstasy, Hennessy, dancing around each other. Bluntness, blunts rolled to keep thought after thought from roiling inside me like wind across water, coercing shapelessness into shape. I put on my best face. I was glamour, I was grammar, yet my best could not best my beast. I too had been taken apart. And I did not want to be fixed. I wanted everything dismantled and useless, like me, case, wheel, hands, dial, face. Because I'm the first in my family to speak, read, write, dream in English, I have to translate my poems into Vietnamese for my mom. And every time we get to the end of that poem, case, wheel, hand, dial, face, she goes, okay. That very nice. And so I tell myself, even though one of my deep beliefs is that poetry is not made just to express, but also to enact. That if I'm talking about falling apart in a poem, if I'm talking about being dismantled in a poem, something also has to fall apart. She doesn't care. And sometimes the people we love most do not know how to love the things that we love, do not know how to appreciate or support the things that we love. And that often it is a sign of how much we're willing to love that thing, to love it anyway, even if we're not understood, even if we're not supported, and to keep on going. And when I find that the going is difficult, when I find that the going is very lonely, I have to remember that actually generations and generations of people have been going and finding their way forward. And I'm just going to be one of them. And one of the folks I go back to in time is the Baroque artist Artemisia Gentileschi, who in 1620 was one of the first women to stand trial and publicly go against her assailant. And even though she did not win, she created art that outlasted whatever that man had to say about her, whatever narrative he thought history would write down. And one of her paintings that I love so very much is that called Judith Slaying Holofernes, about the biblical figure Judith who, when an army of soldiers invades her village, she and her maidservant sneaks into the tent of the general. And after some ooh-ah-ah things, because I know this is a PG-13 crowd, ooh-ah-ah things, she takes out of her gold dress this brilliant sword and she beheads him. And so this poem borrows its voice from Judith and is also called Judith Slaying Holofernes. I know better than to leave the house without my good dress, my good knife, like a crucifix between my stone breasts. Oh, my mother, she would have me kneel on rice until I shrilled so loud I rang the church bells. Didn't I tell you, she would remind me, that elegance is our revenge? That there are neither victims nor victors, but the bitch we envy. In the end, I am that bitch. I'm so dogged. So damned, not even death wanted me. He sent me back after you sacked my body the way your army sacked my village, stacked our headless idols in the same river where our children impaled themselves on rocks. I exit night. I enter your tent, gilded in this bolt of stubborn sunlight, my sleeves already rolled up, and I know what they'll say, slut, for showing this much skin. This irreverence for what is seen when I ask to be seen. Look at me. My thigh lifts from your thigh. My mouth spits poison into your mouth. You nasty beauty, I'm no beast, but when my blade slides clean through your thick neck while my maid keeps your blood off me and my good dress, it'll be a song the parish sings for centuries. Tell Mary, tell Eve, tell Salome and David and Goliath about me. Watch all their faces, like all of yours, turn green. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Two more poems. One, I don't think I've ever read before, but because today's my mom's birthday, I feel like it is as one of the gifts that I can give her. She also called very cleverly the other day and said, haven't you noticed that mommy's been driving the same Toyota Camry since 1994? No, girl, we have not noticed. All right, let's see what our autobiographical lyric poems could do. But I think in that way, oh no, it's, I was really selfish growing up, thinking that I was asked to live and fulfill her impossible dreams. And only lately did I recognize that at my age, she had to leave everything behind, go to a place where she had to give up her own name, her own food, her own language, and how impossible that must have been, and yet she did it. So bitch is getting a Toyota Camry. Scheherazade. Far from the beginning and nowhere near the end. I'd lost count of the nights I spent in that room, knowing no more or less than I did thousands of nights ago, when I thought knowledge still meant something, that it could be found or given or made from what typically in my limited and limiting experience presents as meaningless, just as the image of the face in the mirror might have been had I not likened that image to a swan in a lake, or said I was the lake, I was the swan, the mirror, the face. What more was there to know? After what had been a long journey in silence, the driver asked me what was I doing there. I told him I was a poet. I was there for a reading. I was going to read a poem I wrote about Scheherazade. He asked me to explain what I meant. I told him the story, how my mother told it to me when I was a child, how I had no idea it was her gift to me. To survive, we told the story of our survival. He looked at me. I saw him look at me. Yours isn't just a story about survival, he said. Yours is a story about love. In my version of the story, Scheherazade had no plan. As she waited for the king to come, the moon rose, the candles burned, the moths gathered. In my version of the story, Scheherazade slipped from the bed. She, at the window, leaned into the wind like the tulips in the garden. There was loss at the heart of each blossom. In my version of the story, Scheherazade, bored with sex, with waiting hour after hour for her little death, asked if the king had heard about the child born to a woman named War. In my version of the story, Scheherazade said a man named Beauty abducted the child. Beauty left the child to die alone in a land where they could not speak or find a way home. In my version of the story, Scheherazade, pushing his hair from his face, informed the king that war had brought fire down on every hill and valley, canyon and cliff, searching for the child. In my version of the story, Scheherazade, when the king doubted that someone would destroy everything in their path for another, asked if he was not doing the same thing because of love. In my version of the story, Scheherazade extinguished the candles. The smoke looked like moths in the moonlight. The king asked what love is. This, she answered. He asked what happened next. And then, my mother's name is Jiang. My father's name is Mi. Jiang comes from the Vietnamese word for war. Mi comes from the Vietnamese word for beauty. I am a child of war. I am a child of beauty. Beauty took me from war. Beauty left me. War found me. I left what I come from. I found other wars and other beauties. I took me from them. I took me from me. I took me with me. The word giang also comes from the Vietnamese word for victory. When asked about where the world was in my poems, I was embarrassed to answer that for so long I was incapable of writing poems where my speaker participated actively in the world. My speaker announced themselves in rooms where there was nothing and nobody else. That's where they felt safe. That's where I felt safe. It wasn't that I thought of beauty as propaganda or that I forgot how beautiful the world can be. Smooth jazz 98.1 on a summer afternoon, the percussion of rain on the Pacific Coast Highway, the Santa Anas racing like waves through my hair, his fingers when he drew them from my mouth. It was just too much. And I didn't know what to do. A mystery is a story. A story is a mirror. A mirror is a poem. A poem is a pattern. A pattern is a repetition. Repetition is emphasis. The emphasis is the reason for repetition. Repetition is also a break in a pattern. Breaking a pattern is the reason for a poem. A poem is a mirror I use to look not at, but into myself, my story, mystery. I too will be victorious like my mother. Like Scheherazade, I will survive the end. I'll survive in the end. Even when I was helpless, I was not hopeless. Final poem. I had the great pleasure of teaching a creative writing workshop for 12 Scorpio poets. Anyone who knows what I mean knows that I am indeed a survivor. And halfway through the semester, they had came together in their group chat deciding that I was duplicitous, that I had not been honest, and saying that I was a Taurus sun, Cancer moon, Libra rising. Who was consulted? Mommy. What came down? The projector. What went on the board instead of any lesson on image, detail, or figure? Cafe astrology. And after entering my birth time, my information, we realized that I was a Taurus sun, Cancer moon, Scorpio rising. And so I had to complete one of their prompts, which was to put the next movie I watched into a poem. And I had the great pleasure of being on a very long Delta flight where the only viable option was Finding Nemo. And what's really special is that a poem I had started here in Provincetown, where the original line was, "We know more about the moon than the deep sea." I wanted to revise that poem. And so it became this Finding Nemo poem, which I also call my Scorpio Poets poem, which today will be known as my Provincetown poem. And it's called Bioluminescence. We know it in here, but our PR team tells me that I have to hold the book up periodically so you know what it looks like to get it from your independent booksellers. Hello? Hello? And so we'll start this way, and we'll go around this way. Because again, mommy needs a new carry, so you have to help me move these units, okay? Bioluminescence. There's a dark so deep beneath the sea. The creatures beget their own light. This fact, this feat of adaptation, I could say, is beautiful. Girl, those creatures are hideous. Lantern fish, hatchet fish, viper fish. I, not unlike them, forfeited my own beauty to glimpse this world hidden by eternal darkness. I subsisted on falling matter, unaware from where or why matter fell, and on those weaker creatures, my God, beguiled by my luminosity, my hideous face opening suddenly to take them in to this darkness, darker and more eternal than any underworld under water. I swam and swam and swam and swam toward nowhere and nothing. I, after so much isolation, so much indifference, kept going even when going meant only waiting, hovering in place so far below, so far away from the rest of life, the terrestrial, made possible by and thereby dependent upon light. I did what I had to do. I stalked. I killed. I just wanted to feel in my body at work, working to stay alive. So I swam, I hovered, I kept going, I waited, I found myself without meaning to, without contriving any meaning at the time, in the company of other creatures who, hideous like me, had to be their own illumination, their own God, their own Genesis. And yes, often we feuded, but more often we fused together like anglerfish, blood to blood, desire to desire. We were wild, bewildered, beautiful in our wilderness and our wildness in the most extreme conditions. We proved that life can exist. I exist. I am my life, I thought, approaching at last the bottom of the sea. It wasn't the bottom. It wasn't the sea. Thank you so much.
Paul Tran, amazing. It is such a pleasure to welcome you back to FAWC. When we announced that Paul had accepted our invitation to come, I think there was a collective cheer that went up from the fellows in the room, and I'm so grateful and honored to have hosted you tonight here at the Work Center. Everyone should please not just buy one copy of All the Flowers Kneeling, buy two and give one to your loved ones this Christmas. Thank you. So now I'm so happy to invite up Agnes, who's going to introduce our visiting artist. Please join me in welcoming Agnes Walden to the stage.
One more time for Paul, please. Yeah. My name is Agnes Walden. I'm a painter and a visual art fellow here at the Work Center. Kerry Downey's art has a way of sifting and filtering whatever you bring to it as a viewer. For me, today, looking at their work, anticipating this evening celebrating two phenomenal trans artists, I found myself zooming out, preoccupied as I often am about what we might call the project of transcultural production, which is to say when there are 1,000 trans artists making their work, what are we doing together? What are we enacting on the world when our art happens to it? I absolutely do not have a coherent answer to that myself, but I did pose that question to Kerry's work like a Ouija board, and I want to offer a few proposals or gestures toward answers that I found in Kerry's work. Among the first things I find in the recent video is a campy blonde wig, which those of us in the know recognize as the most crucial ingredient in any worthwhile piece of queer performance art. I keep looking. This time at works on paper from a series entitled Phantom Bounce. In the flimsy handles and rungs depicted in these pieces, I find a witness to the provisional architectures under which people manage to look after each other's bodies. From the abstracted shape of a plastic catheter clip, I think of the ceremony in post-surgery meal trains. I think of changes of bed sheets. In their nets and skins prints, I find that collective spirit again in the motif of holes in paper. These are not the punch of a drill press, but a network of stress points made legible to each other by weathering the same forces of erosion. I think of termite poop, mucosal tissue, and gay chat rooms from the early 2000s internet. In the paperworks from their Wormhole series, I find joy, presence, and embodiment in the jagged residue of Downey's drawing hand, moving through a landscape of acrid pastel doorways with a contagious and hard-earned playfulness. At a time when people speak about our bodies with increasingly clinical and hostile terms, Kerry Downey's work insists that we remain aware that we are also talking about body heat. Now, the art teacher in me has to remind us all that there are as many readings of a painting as there are people in this room. I took you on my little tangent, and what's wonderful about Kerry's work is that when you see it for yourself, you get to shuffle the deck and find your own way in. Please join me in welcoming Kerry Downey to Provincetown and to the Work Center.
Whoa. This is awesome. Thank you, Agnes. Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me. This is an absolute honor, and I'm beside myself. I might even cry a little bit. Speaking of heat, I'm a blusher. Don't worry. I'm okay. Every time I give a talk, I have to ask myself the question of what kind of artist am I today, this week, this month, this year? What are we doing as artists when we go to our studios, go to our notebooks, write, make things? And what does the maintenance and exploration of our radical and critical imaginations do for us and for the world? And I don't have any default answers, but I'm going to focus my talk today on the idea of the wormhole. So I want to share with you a video that I made starting in 2006, and I finished last year. So it's always fun in an artist talk to go back in time and show people, like, this is the work I made in college, this is the work I made in grad school, this is the work I made during the pandemic. Well, this video has all of it in one video. I had this idea during the pandemic that I should reflect and go through my archives, and of course that was a miserable experience. But I was looking for connections, I was looking for meaning, I was looking to make sense of my life and the world. And I was very shocked to look back and say, I think I was making the same video over and over and over again. So there's a repetition, there's a reenactment there. And I noticed that I was kind of performing the artist and doing these absurd and mundane everyday activities. And so I want to show you this mega video that I made that took me, well, I don't know how many years since 2006 that is. I can't do the math, but it's a lot. But it definitely took me all of the last several years to edit. And I think that's all I'll say for now. Hello. Okay, so looking back at all these histories of video art, and it wasn't everything that I had made, but it was a selection of things that had these repetitions in them. I was really stunned by how uncomfortable it was to watch these videos. They were painful. And I don't know, it wasn't really until I got to the halfway through the editing that I realized that I was communicating with past selves, and that in the ways that I could have videos communicate across time and space, that I could also potentiate new futures. And something broke open in me, and I started to come up with this idea that this breakdown was also breakthrough, and that I was tunneling and traveling through wormholes. And the POW, which is the shape on my chest, the chest tattoo, that's also the kind of POW symbol that's repeating, and the hole is this wormhole that's opening up that I actually inaugurated years ago after having top surgery and having this tattooed on my chest. And that in traveling forwards and backwards in time, elsewheres were being produced. And as a genderqueer person, the other side of feeling fractured and broken is to feel multiple. So when I think about the pronouns they and them, they productively confuse people into thinking that I'm made of multiples. And it turns out I am. I am a collection of selves, but also these are collaborative videos, right? I'm picturing myself as this artist par excellence, you know, traveling through these spaces, but you could see the list of people who I made them with, and also art collectives, Action Club, Flux Factory, queer collectives that I was a part of. And they also speak to the many years of teaching in New York City as a teaching artist, and the worlds that we were creating together as a part of our collective survival. I also look back on these videos and I think about the work that I was doing on myself to recover from top surgery. And my therapist, who I was processing all these dirty, abject feelings with, introduced me to Laura Mark's work on haptic visuality. This idea that vision itself can be and is tactile. And it's as though we are touching film through one's eyes. And in Laura Mark's book, The Skin of Film, she talks about how image allows us to experience cinema as a physical and multisensory embodiment. So I think one of the things that I was doing in looking back was that I was creating a new skin for myself, a new wrapping for my genderqueer body. And I was opening up space to also think more critically about whiteness. The Skin of Film is a site of rupture and repair, but also a place for me to work with and through and contemplate my skin as a site of power and privilege. So while I was also working on this video, I was making these new works on paper. And my therapist actually came to the shop where I was working, 10 Grand Press, the print studio, and she was saying, wow, these are a lot like your video. And I was like, what are you talking about? It's completely different. This is just like works on paper, abstract, painterly. And she said, no, they're very digestive and worm-like. So it was very helpful to start thinking like through these metaphors, like, wait a second, like, yeah, I am a funny little worm, and I'm doing this kind of tunneling and decomposition work, which I think maybe a lot of us felt during the pandemic and trying to survive and invisibilizing ourselves from our social worlds. We kind of many of us, I think, can relate to the idea of going underground. But the going underground is also about processing unconscious material and doing a kind of relentless creative labor that sustains us as artists. So this metaphor of the worm and its holes is a metaphor for doing a kind of underground labor or underground work. I also think about the monotype. A lot of these work come out of a monotype process. They're very improvisational, and they're playful, and they're iterative, and working at 10 Grand Press with Marina Ancona, who prints a lot of queer printers and feminist printers, I think about the intimacy of that process of printing and how queer printmaking is as a process. And part of it's there's this amazing vocabulary to work with in the press, which is like you've got the bed of the press, the blankets, the bath, and then this kind of close, intimate collaboration that's so much about intimacy and relationality in printmaking. And I love Marina, she's a master printer, but her mastery is actually about providing support and the role of collaboration and community building in printmaking. I feel like when I print with her too, I am a part of a queer culture and lineage, even when I'm making, you know, quote unquote solo work. Yeah, and so this is just a picture of me in the shop, and just thinking again about the role of the print as very kind of performative and physical, and a lot like my video, it's about these different kinds of touch and activation of surfaces. At the same time, I was also working on these large works on paper, and this one has a big hole in it. So one of the things that started to happen was that my videos were touching across time and space, and the video was influencing the works on paper. The works on paper was influencing the video because I was working on them simultaneously. And I started to also think about queer time, queer temporalities as ruptures in space-time, and how both the video and the works on paper contain this dense haptic activity of tracing and tunneling across surfaces and sites. In search of the whole, I become it, like an earthworm, faith-noodling underground. A lot of this work also, like the video, is this kind of reclaiming of the past, reclaiming of parts of myself. So a lot of the work has scraps. So I'm thinking about the worm working with what they've got, the ready-made, the found object or site, the scrap, reusing materials, including myself. Scraps hold trace histories. They're messy, they're incomplete. I have this deep affection, but also simultaneous anxiety about waste. My super ego can't touch the scrap because it's always on the verge of returning to the trash heap. This helps keeps the stakes low, and it gives me a lot of room for experimentation, but it also helps me think through, you know, the way that refuse can function as refusal. So this is an image from a solo show I just had at Soloway Gallery, curated by Orly Swergold. And part of the show was giving away a pile of scraps. So not everything makes it into the mega video, and not everything makes it back into the works on paper. There's a lot of things that, as I said, end up in the trash heap. But this was a stack of things that I found were interesting, but I couldn't quite place them in the world. So I got this idea that I should give away a lot of the scraps at the opening and throughout the show. And I started to think about this scrap as a defense against loss. This kind of intimate materiality about how this scrap wants to be rescued, right? Like I'm going back in time and rescuing myself from all of these past versions of myself, wanting these versions, these prior artworks to have a kind of belonging in the world, but also how the scrap wants to remain feral and light on its toes. So what happens to the pieces that can't be reintegrated, and how can works move in the world, you know, beyond me? So people came and took these scraps. And just a couple of installation shots from the Wormholes show, where I got to show these works on paper, framed, unframed, hanging in various ways alongside the video. These also kind of give you a sense of the scale too. This is a gallery storefront, Soloway Gallery in Brooklyn. And I'll just show you a few more of these works a little bit more up close. This is a collagraph plate glued onto a scrap from, I don't even know when, probably from grad school. And there's maybe 10 layers with this. I use a lot of physical pressure, so there's rubbing, erasure, there's cuts, abrasions, markings to the surface. And there's a lot of this kind of decomposition process. As Sophie Tran says, the earthworm is the decomposer, capable of turning a compost heap into a web of appetites, chewing through waste, excreting nutrients in soil, producing heat that further encourages the decay process. A heap of inert matter is soon a pulsing, humming, sweating community of creation. So I'm using these vectors of energy, a kinesthetic experience that can hold disgust and shame and grief alongside desire and pleasure. The image event is the possibility of elsewhere. And this is the ecstasy of moving between disintegration and emergence, this idea of moving between ripeness and rot. A lot of this language comes out of a lexicon that I wrote, where I was working with the metaphors of my work. So going back and bringing together all these videos, I was also looking for the kind of thematic metaphors. So they are wormholes, reenactment, the container and uncontainability or the spill, a net and its holes, trans and transitional objects, the archive, third space, POW, and the feminist sublime. These metaphors come from both inside and outside of me. They're synonyms for how figure and ground are co-constitutive. Much like my experience of being trans, a lexicon is always fruitfully in process, a language that is both containing and slippery. A lexicon is also a list of apparitions. As soon as I grab a name, as soon as I grab an idea by its name or phrase, it disappears. This one's called Shit for Brains. It's about the leaky relationship between mind and body, or psyche and soma. This one is about the collapse of time. This one has about 15 different layers, what Katie Gentile calls dense temporality. Here's a new piece, hot off the press. And I'll end with this one. So much like my experience of being trans, the wormhole, or the worm in their holes, is always fruitfully in process, like the lexicon. Queer and trans lives are endlessly improvisational, potentiating possibilities. And in this work, we find our connection and our aliveness. Thank you so much.
Kerry, thank you so much. Join me in thanking Kerry for sharing. So we're so lucky that Paul and Kerry have agreed to do an audience Q&A with us. So I'll invite both of them up to the stage. I love this idea of the feral scraps. That like really resonated with me, and it made me think, Paul, about language and about whether there's a parallel with writers. When something doesn't make its way into the final work, where do those things go to live and have another life?
I mean, I'm sure they do. I tell myself that I keep returning to a draft or to an iteration of a poem that's not done, not because I don't have necessarily the skills to write it. I think there's so many ways to contrive what can be a poem and to make what we hope will pass as poetry in the world. But often when something is not done for me, it's because I don't have the life experience, wisdom, or insight to make it poetry. And so I have to go out there and live more and make more mistakes and think about things and be embarrassed and find truth before I can go back and turn that material into a poem. And sometimes it's many materials, right, from many different projects or many different drafts across time trying to speak to the same thing. But I think ultimately in the end, again, not for lack of writerly ability, but lack of life. And so a lot of living has to be done to turn those scraps into something.
Kerry, it kind of reminds me of what you talked about with the video piece and kind of coming together and reviewing that different sections over time.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be disappointing to myself in the year 2006 that the piece wouldn't be done until now. But I think it would have been more disappointing to that self to say that it was never finished or never found its way into the world and just ended up in the trash heap of my hard drive. So I think there is something about the life that we have to live. And it's not, and those kinds of duration are really strange because I think that that those life experiences can happen in a nanosecond. They can happen so quick, and in that moment, years and years of our lives can find a clarity or find a wisdom, right? So it's nonlinear.
Or even just changing what we call the places we keep things, trash heap, right? Like when I think about the poems I put into the trash, they're never really put into the trash. They're just put away somewhere, and they come back, whether I like it or not.
Yeah, I call that the haunting too, right? Like, I try to get rid of it, try to throw it away. Yeah, I tried to cut my boobs off, but they still haunt me. They're like creatures in the night.
So your tattoo makes me think of superheroes, and I personally believe that superhero artists and writers are superheroes, and I love a good origin story. So I was thinking about both of you tonight, particularly with the kids having been around at the beginning of our evening. Can you reflect back on when you were young and your origin story as a poet and your origin story as an artist? Like, when did you start making? When did you start creating and realizing, wow, this is really something that lights me up and I can do?
Mine is easy. My mom is an artist. She's an art teacher, and she still makes a lot of drawings and things, but never really became like a capital A artist, right? She was mostly like an art teacher. But when I was a kid, really little, like 3, 4, 5 years old, my mom would, for every major season, like draw the outline. We had a black driveway, carport as a kid in South Florida, and that black asphalt, she would draw like with a white chalk the outline of something, like a Thanksgiving turkey or like a pumpkin, and they were really, really big, and she'd be like, make some drawings inside of it, but I just filled it in. I just like would be on my hands and knees all day with my shirt off and my cowboy boots and blue jeans, and this was like my outfit, and it was like my performance outfit was like, go out there all day in the hot sun and fill it in. And so I think that there's something about that like drawing as performance, and also durational, and maybe there's a little superhero endurance in that too, of like, I'm gonna fill this fucking pumpkin in. Yeah.
I think the story I often tell people is that 10 years ago when I was assaulted and the dean of the college on campus safety wouldn't believe me, that I started writing poems because I was lazy, had little work ethic, and no discipline, so I couldn't write prose. Poems were short. And yet, in the space of a poem, I could record what had happened. And so that day after day after day, when I would start to forget what happened, I could go back to the poems and be reminded, and that I would believe myself and the story that I had to tell when no one else would believe me. But I think the true fact is, if poetry is a form of communication or a speech act, then I had been practicing what would become poetry since I was very little, and had to translate into English or translate back into Vietnamese what was going on for my mother at the grocery store, at the post office, at the dentist's office, in a manner that would restore her dignity to her and restore our humanity to us by people who thought we were less because we couldn't speak to them on the terms that they understood. And in fact, it is that very act of making myself human, of making the people I love human, that I've had to practice again and again over the years to make other people think I was worthy of something like going to college, like receiving a scholarship, like, and anything. And so when I teach poetry now to my undergraduate and graduate students, it's not just an art form, it's persuasive communication. What do sounds put together do to the human mind? What do certain words or images, when combined and arranged and patterned, do to their audience? And when we know the science of that doing, that enactment, can we then exact an outcome that we want? For example, if I could turn back time and realize as a 21-year-old how to construct the sentence that would have made the Office of the Dean or Public Safety believe me, I would have. And so that's what I hope to do now.
Thank you for sharing all of that. So I'll invite folks in the audience if you have questions for either of our guests.
Ooh, pop quiz. Yes.
I think both of you spoke about community in your work, your class of Scorpios, and all of your collaborators. And it started me thinking about the fellows who are here. And this cohort in particular, it seems like, is really building strong community ties with one another. Can you talk a little bit about the role of collaboration, the role of your community in your work, but also just in your kind of self-realization?
I mean, I resonate with the they-thems. Especially, my running joke is that with all of the unfulfilled lives and dreams that my family made me live, like they were preparing me for a they-them life. Because I have to be myself and them, and all the thems they can be. And so whenever they get mad, I'm like, you did this. But also in terms of community, like I would not be here without people who loved me when they had no reason to, and who like took care of me and let me sleep on their couch, and whose parents became my parents, you know, like, so sometimes I think that I'm a they, them for all of the they, thems and theirs that have not let me make certain decisions that would have made being here in this moment impossible. And so it's a way of honoring them, which I'm not always good at doing on a day-to-day basis, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I mean, the story of collectivity and collaboration, I think, is its own slide talk for me, and it's elaborate. But when I first got out of college, I moved to New York, and my survival kind of depended on immediately figuring out who were going to be my people and where I was going to sleep. And I moved into an art collective with 17 other people, and I had a room with no windows. We had mice and rats and bed bugs. And I mean, I loved it. It was horrible. Best days of your life. Best days, yeah. But then I also moved on to live in 2 other queer collectives. So I lived 10 out of my 17 years in New York in collectives with 12, 13, 17, 22 people. And I also, you know, as I said, being a teacher too, like my students, the collaborations that I've done through my museum education with community groups. And then every single art project that I've ever made has had collaborators. I mean, even when I'm alone in the studio making a collage, like my partner will come in that night and tell me, good, bad, terrible, throw it out, which I love. It's fun. Yeah. And so that there's like endless collaboration. There's like I'd say that the thing that's hardest about being me in the world is feeling porous. And I'd say it's also the thing that's been part of my survival, is to be porous to other people. And so when I don't feel contained, it is my people who contain me. So I think that collaboration and being in community, I just could not fucking stand the competitiveness of my early years as an artist. So I made things with other people for much of it.
And would you just repeat the question for our viewers at home if we're live streaming?
We both have performance in our practice.
How do we stay authentic to ourselves?
Tough one.
And there was like a third part.
Was there another part there?
No, I think you summarized it well. Those were my 2 questions.
Okay.
Well, I started out in spoken word and poetry slam, which is a performance poetry genre. And often a critique that I faced as an emerging poet is that I am performative in order to hide the fact that I do not write real poetry. And I often am in spaces where that is said directly to me or indirectly, and when it is said indirectly, it is part of an ongoing and larger critique, I think, of queer and trans people of color who purportedly do too much. And the fact of the matter is, if we do not do a lot, we are then critiqued for doing very little. If we are not ambitious, then we are critiqued for not being smart or sophisticated enough. And I think I would say to those very folks that the absence of performance is a performance into itself. And that also, the idea that one has to write real anything, like it's an ongoing, why are certain communities not afforded the chance to learn and grow and must demonstrate upon arrival mastery? Those are some things. But the other part is, they're not entirely wrong. When I started out in spoken word and poetry slam, I knew that there are certain things that I felt were imperative in order to make me undeniable in a space because of the many kinds of ways that I was being looked at and denied access to my own humanity. And so how do I get on stage and make the room listen? How do I get up on stage and create what drag queens would call a charismatic space in which strangers, often because the game was played in bars, often because the judges were already drunk, how would I get drunk strangers who might also be hostile to the very idea of my existence, not only score me well, but score me high enough to move on to the next round and ultimately to win? When part of the issue is, I go into certain spaces and no one would have an idea what I would say. And no one would have any imagination about what I could possibly say that would matter to them. And so the long and short of it is, how do I perform in a way that would make me matter to people? And so the question about authenticity is, in every performance, do I feel like I'm doing this for others? Or am I doing this for myself? And I think at some point in the journey, it began to transition from the thing I did to matter to others and for the thing I did because it is myself. But I would say as just an asterisk, and I'll be done, I can see now in certain kinds of poetry and poetics, when the poet has had the long-standing privilege of never having to have worried about whether they matter to other people, and that their every utterance has come from the position of being listened to and taken seriously and liberated of the kind of artifice that someone like myself would be criticized for performing. And instead, I can sense in the work of folks like me this deep, moving, and sometimes heartbreaking performance of mattering. And yet those are the voices that I think I will dedicate my entire life to helping lift and helping grow and also helping know that we already matter to ourselves and to each other. And the performance is just the sugar on top. It's just the cherry on top. Yes.
Love that. Yes. I really relate to this idea of mattering, and the early study of Judith Butler has me thinking about bodies that matter and mattering as a material, right? Being a body, and for me, the performative aspects of my work and performance in my work is about the moments where I can return to my body as matter, as just meat, right? Like as breath, as piss, as blood, right? And that mattering returning to that and tolerating it, right? Especially like as a young queer person with large breasts and hating my body, how do you tolerate your own mattering if you hate your body, right? So I think for me, making things became a place where I could be in my body, I could tolerate my matter, I could tolerate my mattering in the world, and I could play. And I think play is at the core for me of performance. And as soon as I think about the other watching me, then I'm playing with the edge of safety. And I think that's where my play gets interesting, is when I'm playing alone for myself, there's pleasure. And there's a lot of kind of emancipatory, joy, and there's just, it's really, really fun to make things. And as soon as that little voice comes in, or that little eyeball in the room that's like watching me, I'm no longer fully playing, and my play and my performance and my mattering is at stake. My play is at stake because it's being kind of perceived by whatever fantasy other I have at that moment, which is usually aggressive, right? Is usually shit-talking me. And so how do you keep playing when that eye is upon you? And I think that my work kind of fundamentally is playing with that edge. So authenticity comes right at that moment, where not just the eye comes in and surveils me, but I keep playing anyway. Yeah.
Something you just said, Kerry, made me think.
Please.
There's the kind of performance that is for others, and it allows the other not to really do anything, but to observe and gaze and just comfortably judge you.
Yeah.
And then there's the kind of performance that is with others. And I think often people get angry with me because they realize that I'm performing with them and that they've been implicated into the performance itself, that it has elicited or exacted something. And so the criticism of over-performing is because they realize that they no longer get to be a voyeuristic audience that is safe and far away from me, but actually myself, them, the poem, one body, and they can't stand it.
Other questions in the room? Thank you, Stephanie. Oh. Helen?
I mean, it really changes based on the context. How and when I'm watching, and rewatching all my old videos, even alone in my studio or whatever, was truly unbearable. I kept like rereading about abjection. I was like, what does it mean to be abject again? And then people would like watch my videos. I was like, watch these old videos with me. They're like, I don't see it. They're just kind of like painterly pretty. You're like touching things. And I'm like, no, they're like dripping with abjection. And I think that's because for me, they were taking me back to these parts of myself that I had split off. And so rewatching them, I had to see the footage again, I had to kind of do a kind of integration work in order to just like see it as material. So it was really a fascinating, elaborate emotional, psychological process, to get to like kind of formal play, actually. And then, you know, like sometimes when I rewatch this video, it's really unbearable. I actually watched Wormholes with my students this week because I'm teaching video right now. I was like, I'll just show it to them. They'll love it. And they like, it was like dead silence. Like, and so it was kind of horrible. I like hated watching it. I was watching it like I was surveilling myself. So I think it actually still depends on the moment and the time. It changes in the situation. But I'd say a lot of times rewatching myself on film is very unpleasant. But I think that it still does something really important for me as an artist, like being my own material to work with, and the making of them is so fun. So there is a funny split. Yeah, there's a lot to tolerate in rewatching my work.
A way I would like to answer this question is, I think there's, I think of it like my favorite musicians. I got to see Beyonce for the first time in concert this past summer, and that was such a different experience than ever watching a YouTube video or listening to her on my iPhone. And in a not dissimilar way, I want for the reader, when they are reading the poems on the page, to have their own intimate experience, when the voice that is the poem in their mind is their own voice reading it, and then they come to a reading such as this, and I get to do the thing that I do. But towards the idea that there are moments when I memorize the poems and I read them, no matter if the poem is memorized in my mind or if it's something that is on the page and I'm reading in real time, the language has to exact its impact on me that I hope is the impact it's making on someone I've never met before. And so there was a point in reading from the poem Scheherazade tonight that I don't think I've ever read as part of a reading, that something deep in my mind was like, oh wow, we did that. Like, we really fucking did that. And that's how I know the poem has found its body, is that, oh, regardless of the things I might change about it, regardless of the information I know about language now, I read it from memory or I read it on the page and it still works its enchantment on me. And so I'm not sure if it's a kind of splitting, but actually a really tall order that my work, for me, that my work cast its spell even on me after so many drafts, after so many revisions. After, I can close my eyes and maybe write the book from memory on a board for you, but no matter how many times I've seen it and said it and thought it, that it works its enchantment on me. And why that matters is, if we write for the purpose of expression or conciliation, that magic is okay to me at best. But if we write for the purpose of self-transformation, so that after the poem is read, after the poem is done, we are changed, our vision of ourself is changed, we are free to make new choices, that magic is paramount. And so, yes, that is the tall order I put, whether or not it's a poem I've memorized or have to read.
Well, I think that's a pretty beautiful moment to close this portion of the evening. Huge gratitude and thanks to Kerry and Paul for sharing their magic with us. Paul will be signing copies of books at the back. And we have open studios and other great activities still for the rest of the night. So please enjoy, everybody.